Hi there, my name is Hannah Gannon, and today I am going to be discussing, I'm going to be talking a little bit about HIV, what it is, how it works and manifests in the body, as well as one of the treatment methods for it, which is called AZT. So, I am going to start off with just kind of talking a little bit about what HIV is and how it manifests in the body. So HIV stands for Human Immunodeficiency Virus, and how it works is it actually attacks the human immune system, and so that's kind of how it manifests. It's actually part of what's called a retrovirus class, and these viruses are known for actually they have their genetic material in the form of RNA, and what they do is they actually use an enzyme called reverse transcriptase to reverse transcribe the RNA into DNA and do a few things with that then. And so another subclass that HIV is considered to be in is called a lentivirus. And these viruses are just known to cause disease in a slow manner. And that's something that HIV definitely does. So, like I was saying before, HIV stores its genetic material in the form of RNA. And what happens is it actually reverse transcribes its RNA into DNA. And once it produces what's called retrovirus DNA, that's actually going to be implemented into the host DNA. And then it will probably remain dormant it can remain dormant up to like 1 to 10 years. And then afterwards, it can actually use the host cell's machinery to then transcribe and translate the DNA. And so it will transcribe it into DNA and then transcribe it into RNA, produce mRNA, and then even make viral proteins. And so the specific cells that HIV infects are called CD4 cells. And these are actually white blood cells that respond to different infections in the body. And so what HIV does is over a long period of time, it will end up killing a lot of the CD4 cells, and the body's not able to respond to infections or anything like that. And so a lot of times people who have HIV, they don't necessarily die from HIV itself, but they die from, a disease like the flu or something, where typically they'd be able to have that immune response, but because of HIV killing all of those CD4 cells, they're not able to have that response necessary. So that's typically how it works and manifests. So going forward, I want to talk about a little bit about one treatment method. Although there's no cure to HIV and AIDS, there are a lot of different treatment methods, and one of them that we're going to talk about is called AZT. Now, AZT is usually actually given with several other different medications, kind of in like a cocktail form, just to kind of target different mechanisms, I would say. So specifically for AZT, the first thing that happens is it actually has to be transformed into AZTTP. So what happens is when it's taken up by the host cell, it's going to be converted to AZTTP by what's called a cellular kinase. And kinases are actually enzymes, and they add phosphate groups. And they add these phosphate groups by taking a phosphate from an ATP. So that ATP is then going to be turned into an ADP, and then you have that extra phosphate and then in turn, the kinase is going to use to phosphate something. And so that's how AZT becomes AZTTP. Now, something that's important to note is that AZTTP is what's called a DNTP analog, and this is actually going to bind to the reverse transcriptase template complex, and it's actually going to be incorporated into the growing viral DNA template, or into the a viral DNA strand. So what happens next, or another thing that is really important to note, is just that AZTTP has a very high affinity for reverse transcriptase. So that's something that's really important to remember, because structurally it's really similar to what's called thymidine triphosphate, and that's actually a normal structural component of DNA. And so because it's very, very similar, that's like a key component to how this drug works, because it is very similar in structure to the thymidine triphosphate. However, because it has a higher affinity for reverse transcriptase, the reverse transcriptase is going to, or it's going to and be incorporated rather than the thymidine triphosphate into the growing viral DNA strand. And so the one key component for how AZTTP differs and why it's able to stop DNA synthesis is because it actually contains a nitrogen group rather than a hydroxyl group. And so when it's incorporated into the proviral DNA strand, it actually stops synthesis because you're not able to add another component or substrate to the DNA strand that's trying to grow. And so in turn, you're going to stop that synthesis, and you're not going to be able to, or like the HIV is not able to become like or make viral mRNA or proteins. So that's kind of how it works. Now, this is kind of what I touched on earlier. So AZT is actually, AZT is actually what's called a nucleoside analog, or a nuke. And so I thought that was pretty interesting. It's called a nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitor because it blocks the HIV production by inserting a nucleoside into the chain of the HIV DNA, and it's going to stop the synthesis of that DNA strand. So that's kind of how it works in a big picture scheme. So one thing that I just wanted to touch on really quickly was just again, just like the big idea of how this works. So AZT is going to become the active form of AZTTP, which has those 3 phosphate groups because it's triphosphate. And normally you can, as you can see in this picture, so you'll have like the nucleosides that are going to be added to the growing DNA strand from reverse transcriptase, because again, you're going from RNA to DNA, RNA to DNA. And then you're going to have the AZTTP, or AZTTP is going to be incorporated, and again, it's going to stop the synthesis of that growing strand. So that's kind of how it works. And lastly, I just wanted to kind of show some of the sources that I used to gather all this information for you, and then those are the links to all of the pictures that I showed as well. So again, my name is Hannah, and thank you for listening to my presentation on the treatment of HIV with AZT.